Yes, student. Good morning, all of you. Once again, I welcome you all to the class of English Optional BA third year. In the previous class, we dealt with perspective of one of the leading romantic poets, William Wordsworth. Today, we are going to study Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction or theory of poetic language. William Wordsworth was primarily a poet and not a critic. When Wordsworth took for writing, it was the neoclassical criticism which held the day. Poetry was judged by, or it was judged on the basis of rules advocated by Aristotle and other Greek, Latin, and French critics. They gave importance to allow the rules. Rules were strictly followed. They gave importance to follow the rules, methods, and outward form. They didn't care for the substance, the soul of poetry. Wordsworth is the first poet critic to turn from the form of poetry to its substance. He is the first critic who gave a theory of poetry and an account of the nature of the creative process. His emphasis is on novelty, experiment, liberty, spontaneity, inspiration, and imagination. His theory is contrasted with the classical emphasis on authority, tradition, and restraint. Wordsworth's theory of poetic language. Essentially, the Wordsworthian theory of poetic language is a criticism against the theory of poetic diction. The central doctrine is that the language of poetry is identical with the language of everyday communication. Thus, figurative language is not poetic. It is artificial. Wordsworth advocates a purely natural idiom of expression because the poet is a man speaking to men. His language should be of the language of common man. It should not differ from that of others. The poet thinks and feels in the spirit of human passions. Therefore, his language should be the language of men. He adds that there is no any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical compositions, that is poetry. Wordsworth has restricted his observations to lyrical poetry. He stresses the idea of passion, but rustic speech in its primal simplicity is passionate. The language used by farmers or rustics is supposed to be highly charged with emotions. Besides, the qualities of naturalness and universality, He emphasizes that poetic language must be language in a state of vivid sensation. Such language, if selected judicially and variegated with metaphors, can give that pleasure peculiar to poetry. The important features of Wordsworth's poetic theory of poetic language. Wordsworth believes that the poet is essentially a man speaking to men. So, the poet must make use of such a language as is used by men. His language should be the language of common men. It should not differ from them. The second feature is he believes that there is no essential difference between language of prose and metrical composition. The third feature of Wordsworth's theory of language is he condemns the artificial language in the poetry. He insists on choosing incidents and situations from common life and a selection of language really used by men. The next feature is he adds that the language of these men should be used only after purifying it because there is certain painful and disgusting elements in that language. Only a judicious selection of such a language can give pleasure. Further, he points out that rustic language in its simplicity is highly emotional and passionate. It comes from the heart and thus goes direct to the heart. So, such a language communicates the essential truths of human life. These are some of the contents of Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction. Let us have a look at limitations, contradictions in his theory of diction. Several arguments can be leveled against Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. His theory of poetic diction is full of a number of contradictions and suffers from a number of contradictions. Firstly, Wordsworth does not state what he means by language. Language is a matter of words as well as of syntax. It is also a matter of the use of imagery, frequency of its use, and its nature. Wordsworth does not make it clear what does he mean by language. Secondly, a selection of language used by men is not the same as the language of ordinary speech. A specially selected language has all the qualities of figurative expression. Moreover, figures of speech can really express great passion. Metaphorical communication is packed with passion. Thirdly, Wordsworth had forgotten the fact that in his own best poetry, these very qualities are present. Though there are some weaknesses in Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction, and he didn't follow his theory, in his own best poetry, its significance is far reaching. We must keep in mind that Wordsworth was inspired by psychological considerations when he wrote on poetic diction and concept of poetry. So, friends, today we have come across Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction or Wordsworth's theory of poetic language. In the following class, that is on tomorrow, we shall deal with a critical note on Wordsworth's concept of poetry. With this, I would like to remain here. Thank you very much.